All right, so why did Putin choose to invade Ukraine? I was looking at Jacobin, the website, and they had an article with that title. And I was like, oh, look, goody. Here, even though they're a socialist magazine, I definitely don't agree with them on economics, but, maybe they're going to shed some insight onto some geopolitical stuff. Click on the article, start reading, like, the interview, and it was anything but the actual reason. It's like you can you don't have to agree with it, right? You don't have to agree with Osama bin Laden to publish the supposed reasons why he perpetrated a terrorist attack. Same here. You don't have to agree with Putinism or his philosophy, but at least tell the reader, even not exactly what he says, because the things that are coming out of his mouth could be, specifically deceiving. At least take a stab in the dark as far as what he really wants. Read in between the lines. I clicked the article, and it was everything but that. It was about the troop buildup. Some Ukrainians went through so much that they, couldn't fathom, or just like they went through such hardships that they couldn't fathom about, or they're just used to risk. The Russian experts inside of Kremlin that follow Russia, didn't realize, blah, 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 blah. Then they went on to talk about, how white Ukrainian refugees are treated different than Afghanis, then the power of sanctions to stop it, everything but the actual explanation. Well, I'll give it a stab. Pretty sure if you want to understand Russian ideology, or Putinism anyway, I'm not going to say that Putin speaks for entire Russia. I don't think he does. But if you want to understand Putinism, probably have to look up Alexander Dugin. He's like one of the only philosophers that have been like censured by the EU, or some like only like very privileged distinction about. Yeah, he's a Russian philosopher. Very, very, highly respected intellectual in Russia, and apparently even had he talked to Putin every now and again, and he has a geopolitical idea, a theory. And I've listened to some interviews. You could actually go ahead and search for him on YouTube. He doesn't speak English that well, but he actually, he does speak English, and he does give interviews, even as far as back at the start of the invasion. Basically, the real reason, he made an analogy where they believe in a multipolar world where big countries throw their weight around in the global chess game. And he said that it was such a tragedy that, NATO and he would consider that Europe is somewhat mixed between traditional and liberal, and United States that's just completely liberal. And the issue with liberalism, it's that it's always spreading further and further. Now, he would still respect the United States as far as its own liberal civilization, with its own benefits, its own drawback. He personally doesn't like liberalism, but they respect that United States is a big, powerful country and has its own interests in its own hemisphere and this and that. But at the same time, he made a chess analogy where the liberal, the EU, the NATO, the Western world order, they were the only players at the chessboard, and then they're the only ones moving the pieces. I guess that's an analogy comparing moving NATO and EU and everything closer and closer to Russia's border. And Putin came along and said, "Hey, can I play?" and started moving the chess pieces in where he wanted to. And he takes the analogy even further, saying that it's not necessarily United States and Russia. Other polarities can come up, maybe like India or China, or and then they could also throw their weight around as far as on the world stage. So I would translate it to Russia has like like as its own culture. It's not Western. It's not global homo. It's not the EU. It's not liberal, and they have their own civilization that respects family, tradition, not quote unquote dignity. I don't know exactly what that means, which is interesting too because it's not. A lot of people would try to use the old definitions or the old paradigms where, oh, it's like capitalism versus communism, or it's like a race, like one race versus another race. To them, it's completely geopolitical. How Putin is just very practical. Like one big pole, one big country gets to throw their weight around and to influence their neighbors and other. I would just say because there's between countries, there's no such thing as rules. There's basically anarchy between on the level of countries. So basically, it's might makes right. Russia before was weak, couldn't play game, couldn't be at the table. Now they're stronger. They can be at the table. And he would invite other players to rise up, like probably India and China and maybe some places in Iran or whatever, and then start throwing their weight around too. Do I agree with that personally? No, not really, because it seems very self-serving. Because Russia's a big country, then it's you have the theory like, well, it should throw away its weight around. Well, what if Russia was a small country? Then they probably wouldn't feel that's the same way. I mean, I would rather break up all big countries. I'd break up even the United States. Even every state could be its own country with radically different laws. And if people can move freely in between those states, then you could really see it's like a laboratory, a lot of experiments, see what place people actually want to live. And if Ohio is bigger, more powerful than Kentucky, should Ohio be a pole and throw its weight around and have whatever influence and meddle in Kentucky? I don't think so. I don't think that on the country level either. It's also interesting. I could see the conservative coverage. Obviously, conservatives, from what I read, like at AmericanThinker.com, a lot of them went super jingoistic and say, "Oh no, you're going up against our precious NATO. You're going up against our influence, America's influence. Well, you're a bad guy. We should show you nothing but force." Which, in a weird way, it's interesting because now they're defending American values, whereas if it wasn't the Ukrainian invasion, they'll be complaining about America. It's like, if you're more ideologically with Russia, you're against so much. You're not. I mean, Russia is not really against capitalism per se, but it doesn't. It thinks the liberal world order embraces capital consumerism too much, right? So they're against consumerism. They're pro-family. They're more religious. They're not so embracing. I mean, I think the LGBT stuff, it's not. They don't want to condemn it, but they're saying they embrace it they don't want to promote it. They embrace it on their own terms, that type of stuff. They don't want to force it on other, you know what I mean? They don't want to promote that type of lifestyle, if you see what I mean. But those type of values, they align so much closer to Putin's Russia. So from ideological perspective, wouldn't they rather, if they want to see those values expanded, would be like, yeah, you know what? We should, until America becomes more conservative and less liberal, we should we should let Russia, maybe take. I mean, I wouldn't say like Russia would just like completely take over, invade every country, but would just say, hey, Russia would have a lot more influence of Eastern Europe and spread. You know what I mean? And the world would be a lot more quote unquote based. It's an interesting dichotomy because I know deep down inside they do support Russia and Putin, but they all get jingoistically and very anything that goes against quote unquote American imperialism, even though America is in fact, and they think that America is infected with too much liberalism. Then you also have this awful coverage in like if you go to any like Daily Mail or CNN, the American coverage of this war invasion is pretty awful because either could never be objective about what's going on the ground. If Russia takes some territory, or they lost some troops, but they kill. It's like pure. It's basically like if you were to log on to like Zelensky.com. It's like pure Ukrainian propaganda. Either one, Russia is retreating, taking on horrible losses. Look at all these awful tanks, and look at the morale is really bad. Or two, they'll never tell you about a Russian advance. They'll just say, oh, look, a maternity ward. Look at all these war crimes. Look at all these civilian places that have been bombed. So a viewer, a person that wants to get a more of a balanced, more realistic view of what's going on with the invasion, they have to read, Telegram, pro-Russian Telegram, just to kind of see like, or watch pro-Russian YouTube channels like, okay, well, to see where the war is Ukraine gaining ground? Is Russia losing ground? Is it a stalemate or what? And another interesting thing is that this war, I'm not going to hold out too much hope, but it's possible that it's advancing technology in a way. Well, yes, Russia is going to be economically, retarded by this. It's going to be hit, lower standards of living. But Russia is such a big country that is it possible they might, let's say, advance cryptocurrencies? Somebody today in the Russian government, I don't know if they'll follow through with this. I mean, it's highly skeptical, but at first they were saying they were going to, the EU countries that buy, or European countries that buy oil, well, because they got banned from SWIFT and all this retaliation, they're unfriendly countries, you have to buy the oil with rubles. But then they floated, even more interesting, well, we can take Bitcoin, which is pretty interesting because I don't know this for a fact, but partly it seems that Americans' high standard of living is due to the American dollar being a reserve currency. They can print a whole bunch of that currency and flood the world, and then and use it to exchange to buy real goods like cars and stuff from China. And what would happen if so many people didn't want the US dollar that much? And America had to export, instead of dollars in debt, had to export real goods. Had to actually trade goods to be able to import goods. Or the U.S. government prints more than half, or prints more than half of its budget. Would it have to literally cut program? I mean, it'd be super insanely painful to raise taxes. I mean, economically, like you fall into depression to make up for the borrowing. So would the United States government actually have to cut military welfare to compensate? I don't know, but it's interesting to find out, especially with cryptocurrencies. What if it's, of course, the government's really are going to kick, they're going to like kick, scream, they're not going to want to do this. But what if a conglomeration of countries, more and more countries, start adopting Bitcoin and start using it for trade more and more, and the fiat currencies become less and less relevant? I mean, I think that would be a welcome development. I think America weaponizing the dollar, I mean, basically weaponizing the dollar and using the dollar as like welfare, well, it might eventually come to an end.